At 9:17 a.m. on April 22, 1942, Lieutenant Commander Edward O'Hare walked into the Grumman Aircraft Engineering Corporation factory in Bethpage, New York, carrying vital information that would change the course of the Pacific War. At 27 years old, O'Hare had already earned 7 confirmed kills and worn the Medal of Honor, which had been presented to him by the President the previous day. But this wasn't a publicity visit. O'Hare was there because American pilots were dying in planes that couldn't match the Japanese Zero, and the Navy needed a solution. Fast waiting for him was William Schwendler, Grumman's chief designer. At 38 years old, Schwendler had 15 years of experience in designing naval aircraft and had been working since 1941 on a replacement for the F4F Wildcat. The contract for the new fighter had been signed 6 months before Pearl Harbor, and while the prototype was set to fly in 2 months, the design was far from finished. Schwendler knew the Wildcat had to be replaced quickly because it simply couldn't compete with the Zero. The Wildcat had a maximum speed of 318 mph, slower than the Zero's 350 mph. The Wildcat couldn't climb as fast, and it couldn't turn as sharply. In a horizontal dogfight, the Zero could complete a full turn in half the time it took the Wildcat, and that made all the difference. American doctrine instructed Wildcat pilots to avoid turning fights with Zeros, instead relying on speed, altitude, and hit-and-run tactics. But the Wildcat wasn't fast enough to execute this strategy effectively. Zeros could catch Wildcats in a climb and follow them in a dive, exploiting the Wildcat's performance limitations. O'Hare knew the problem wasn't pilot error or failure to follow doctrine, it was the aircraft itself. The Wildcat was a good plane for 1941, but the Japanese had been flying the Zero since 1940, and the Wildcat couldn't keep up. O'Hare had witnessed this firsthand, with 42 Wildcats lost in the first 4 months of the war, many of them in situations where superior aircraft performance could have made the difference. The Navy needed a new fighter, and O'Hare was there to tell Grumman exactly what it needed to be. O'Hare had earned the Medal of Honor on February 20, 1942, after single-handedly defending the carrier Lexington against 9 Japanese bombers. He shot down 5 of them in under 5 minutes using only 60 rounds of .50 caliber ammunition. That incredible display of aerial gunnery earned him respect, and the Bureau of Aeronautics trusted his judgment. O'Hare knew the Wildcat inside and out, and was the perfect person to give Grumman the information they needed to design a better fighter. During a 4-hour meeting with Schwendler and the Grumman design team, O'Hare outlined in detail the tactics of the Zero, how it baited Wildcats into turning fights, exploited their climb rate advantages, and used its superior range to extend combat far beyond the Wildcat's capabilities. He described the Wildcat's weaknesses: sluggish controls, inadequate power, poor visibility, and dangerous landing gear. But he also highlighted the Wildcat's strengths. It was tough, could absorb damage, and had enough firepower to destroy a Zero with one good burst. The problem was that pilots needed better performance to get into position for that shot. Schwendler listened intently, taking detailed notes and asking specific questions. O'Hare outlined the changes needed for the next fighter, starting with more power. The Wildcat's engine, a Wright R-1820 Cyclone, only produced 200 horsepower. O'Hare said the new fighter needed at least 2,000 horsepower, preferably more. Schwendler knew that the Pratt & Whitney R-2800 double Wasp engine, which produced 2,000 horsepower, was already in use in the Vought F4U Corsair. Could Grumman use that engine in the new fighter? O'Hare said yes, whatever it took to build a fighter that could outmatch the Zero in speed, climb rate, and overall performance. In addition to more power, O'Hare insisted on better cockpit visibility, a higher mounted seat for improved sightlines, hydraulic landing gear, and additional armor to protect the pilot. The Wildcat's hand-cranked landing gear was dangerous, and its cockpit was too low for good visibility. O'Hare also recommended more firepower, perhaps additional guns or even 20mm cannons, to increase the fighter's lethality. Schwendler acknowledged that these changes were feasible, but would require approval from the Bureau of Aeronautics. Time was of the essence. 4 days later, the Bureau gave Grumman the green light to proceed with the modifications. The R-2800 engine, higher cockpit, hydraulic landing gear, and more armor. The Navy wanted the new fighter in combat by mid-1943, so production had to start immediately. Grumman worked around the clock to redesign the aircraft. The new F6F Hellcat, with its more powerful engine, larger airframe, higher cockpit, and enhanced armament, took shape quickly. By July 30, 1942, test pilot Robert Hall flew the first prototype, the F6F3, for 45 minutes. The aircraft showed promise, but there were issues including engine overheating, slow landing gear retraction, and gun synchronization problems. Within weeks, Grumman fixed these issues, and by October 3, 1942, the first production Hellcat took to the skies. The Navy quickly accepted the Hellcat, and production ramped up in early 1943. By the summer of 1943, Grumman was producing 500 Hellcats per month. The new fighter was a game-changer. It gave American pilots the edge they needed to finally overcome the Zero. The first Hellcat squadron to receive the new planes, Fighting Squadron 9, was equipped with the F6F3s in January 1943. The Hellcat would soon turn the tide of the air war in the Pacific. Tory, having flown Wildcats in combat, knew firsthand how outmatched they were against Zeros. When he saw the Hellcat for the first time, he could hardly believe it came from the same manufacturer. The Hellcat was significantly larger than the Wildcat, 33 feet 7 inches long versus 28 feet 10 inches, with a wingspan of 42 feet 10 inches compared to the Wildcat's 38 feet. The Hellcat's empty weight was 9,238 pounds, nearly double the Wildcat's 5,758 pounds. But the most important difference was performance. The Hellcat could reach a top speed of 380 mph at 17,300 feet, compared to the Wildcat's 318 mph. The Hellcat's climb rate was also better, 3,500 feet per minute versus 2,300. Additionally, the Hellcat had a longer range, 1,040 miles with a belly tank, compared to the Wildcat's 950 miles. Most importantly, the Hellcat was powered by the R2800 engine, which produced 2,000 horsepower. The difference was stark. Tory told his pilots, "This aircraft will change everything." The days of evading Zeros were over. They now had a fighter that could stand and fight. Fighting Squadron 9 spent 5 months training intensively with the Hellcat. They practiced gunnery, formation flying, carrier landings, and combat tactics. The Hellcat was easier to fly than the Wildcat in many ways. The hydraulic landing gear was a revelation. Pilots no longer had to crank a handle 99 times while maintaining formation. Instead, they simply flipped a switch and the gear extended automatically. The improved visibility made formation flying safer, and the added power made every maneuver easier. However, the Hellcat was also heavier and faster, requiring pilots to adjust their landing approach speeds and learn new weight and balance limitations. By August 1943, VF-9 was ready for combat. They deployed aboard the USS Essex as part of Task Force 15, which also included the Yorktown and the light carrier Independence. This was the first time an entire carrier group was equipped exclusively with Hellcats. No more Wildcats, every fighter in the task force was now a Hellcat. The target was Marcus Island, a small Japanese base located 850 miles northwest of Wake Island. The base was defended by around 35 aircraft, mostly Zeros, and heavy anti-aircraft batteries. The mission was to strike at dawn on August 31, 1943, and destroy as much as possible before the Japanese could mount a coordinated defense. At 4:15 a.m. on August 31st, aircraft began launching from the carriers. Tory led VF-9 off the Essex, while Commander Charles Cromwell led VF-5 off the Yorktown. The Hellcats formed up in the pre-dawn darkness and headed toward Marcus Island. They arrived at 5:50 a.m. just as the sun rose, and the island was clearly visible below them. Tory could see aircraft parked on the airfield, buildings scattered across the island, and the dark silhouette of a radar tower. Tory's division dove first, coming in from the east with the sun behind them. The Japanese were caught completely off guard. No fighters scrambled to intercept, and while the anti-aircraft batteries opened fire, the Hellcats were too fast. Tory's division destroyed 6 aircraft on the ground in the first pass, then climbed back to altitude for a second run. By then, the entire strike force was engaged. Bombers hit fuel depots and supply buildings, and fighters strafed everything that moved. The island was engulfed in smoke and flames. 2 Hellcats were lost to anti-aircraft fire. 1 pilot died, while the other was rescued by submarine 3 days later. But no Japanese aircraft managed to take off. The raid was a complete success. More importantly, the Hellcat had proven itself in combat. performing exactly as designed. Fast, powerful, and tough. Pilots returned to the carriers raving about the aircraft. It was everything the Wildcat wasn't, and it was the fighter America needed. The next test came on September 1st, when Hellcats from the Independence intercepted a Japanese flying boat near Howland and Baker Islands. Lieutenant Junior Grade Richard Lowe and Ensign Arthur Nyquist teamed up to shoot it down, marking the Hellcat's first aerial victory. More engagements followed. On October 5th, Hellcats from 4 carriers struck Wake Island, where they encountered 34 Zeros. The Hellcats shot down 22 Zeros and lost 6 aircraft, 4 to Zeros, and 2 to anti-aircraft fire. The kill ratio was better than 3.1, far superior to the Wildcat's performance. But the real test came on December 4, 1943, at the Battle of Guadalcanal in the Marshall Islands. 91 Hellcats from 3 carriers encountered 50 Zeros. The Zeros launched aggressive attacks using the same tactics that had devastated Wildcats for 2 years. But this time those tactics didn't work. The Hellcats were faster, had better climb rates, and more power. When the Zeros tried to engage in turning fights, the Hellcats could disengage and climb away. When the Zeros tried to dive away, the Hellcats could follow them down. The performance gap had reversed. Now the Americans had the superior aircraft. The battle lasted just 37 minutes, during which the Hellcats shot down 28 Zeros. Only 2 Hellcats were lost, and the kill ratio was an astounding 14-1. It was the most lopsided aerial victory the American Navy had achieved against Japanese fighters during the entire war. The Hellcat's superiority over the Zero was now undeniable. By the end of December 1943, 6 carrier air groups were equipped with Hellcats, and more were in training. The Navy's entire fighter force was transitioning to the F6F. The Wildcat was relegated to escort carriers, where its shorter takeoff distance was more advantageous. The Hellcat became the standard fleet carrier fighter, and pilots loved it. The Japanese began to notice the change. Pilot reports from Japanese carrier and land-based air groups noted that American fighters were performing differently, faster, more aggressive, and harder to evade. Tactics that had worked reliably against Wildcats were now failing against the new aircraft. The Japanese designated the Hellcat as Grumman 6, distinguishing it from the earlier Grumman 4 Wildcat. But identifying the aircraft was easier than countering it. One of Japan's top aces, Lieutenant Commander Saburo Sakai, had learned how to exploit Wildcat weaknesses over the years. But in February 1944, when he engaged a Hellcat over a ball, he discovered that his old tactics no longer worked. Sakai tried his usual approach, positioning his Zero at altitude, waiting for the American to commit to an attack, then reversing course and diving to get behind the American during the climb-out. This tactic had worked countless times against Wildcats, but the Hellcat climbed faster than Sakai expected. By the time he completed his dive and pulled up, the Hellcat had already regained altitude and was positioning for a counterattack. Sakai had no choice but to break off and retreat. It was the first time in the war he had been forced to disengage from a defensive position against an American fighter. Japanese intelligence tried to figure out what had changed. They examined wreckage from downed Hellcats but found no unusual modifications. The Hellcat was simply a better aircraft, more power, better speed, and better climb rates. The engine was bigger, the airframe was stronger, and everything about the Hellcat was designed to outperform the Zero in the areas that mattered most in combat. By mid-1944, Japan's carrier aviation was in crisis. They had lost many of their experienced pilots at Midway and in the Solomon Islands, and the replacements were hastily trained and inexperienced. They were flying the Zero, an aircraft optimized for 1941 combat conditions, while American pilots flew Hellcats designed specifically to counter Zero tactics. With input from Medal of Honor recipients like O'Hare, the result was inevitable. On June 19, 1944, at the Battle of the Philippine Sea, 15 American carriers with 480 Hellcats faced 9 Japanese carriers with 370 aircraft, mostly Zeros. The Hellcat had proven its superiority, and now it was the defining moment for the American Navy in the Pacific. The Japanese launched 4 massive raids against the American fleet, but the Hellcats intercepted every one of them. The first Japanese raid lost 42 out of 69 aircraft, and the second raid lost 98 out of 128. By the end of the day, the Japanese had lost 240 carrier aircraft, with another 30 lost to operational accidents. The American losses were much lower, only 29 aircraft, most of which were shot down by anti-aircraft fire. Hellcat pilots called it the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, the most one-sided aerial battle in naval history. One pilot described it like hunting back home, except the targets were Japanese aircraft and they didn't run away fast enough. The kill ratio for the day was about 13-1, with the Hellcats completely dominating the Zeros. Japanese carrier aviation never recovered from that loss. The combination of inexperienced pilots and inferior aircraft against experienced American pilots flying Hellcats proved devastating. One Hellcat pilot who became famous that day was Commander David McCampbell, Air Group Commander aboard the USS Essex. McCampbell shot down 7 Japanese aircraft on June 19, 1944, becoming an ace in a day. 4 months later, during the Battle of Leyte Gulf on October 24th, McCampbell would achieve that status again. He and his wingman, Ensign Roy Rushing, engaged 60 Japanese aircraft. McCampbell shot down 9 aircraft, 7 Zeros and 2 Oscars, while Rushing shot down 6. Together they destroyed 15 aircraft in one mission, the most successful 2-plane engagement in American aviation history. McCampbell landed aboard the Langley with only 2 rounds of ammunition left and his fuel tanks completely empty. He had been airborne so long that the carrier deck crews had already given him up for lost. McCampbell finished the war with 34 aerial victories, all in Hellcats. He became the Navy's all-time leading fighter ace and received the Medal of Honor for his actions at Leyte Gulf. His air group, KAG-15, destroyed over 600 Japanese aircraft during their combat tour, more than any other air group in the Pacific. Every pilot in KAG-15 flew Hellcats, all based on the design specifications that came from Butch O'Hare's meeting with Grumman engineers in April 1942. By November 1945, when Hellcat production ended, Grumman had built 12,275 aircraft. At its peak in 1944, Grumman produced 644 Hellcats in 1 month, roughly 1 every hour around the clock. It was one of the most successful production programs in aviation history. The Hellcat achieved a 19.1 kill ratio against Japanese aircraft. 75% of all Navy and Marine Corps aerial victories in the Pacific were scored by Hellcat pilots. 306 pilots became aces flying Hellcats, more than any other American fighter. Only 270 Hellcats were lost in air-to-air combat during the entire war. The aircraft was so successful that late in the war, Navy evaluations comparing Allied and captured Axis fighters ranked the Hellcat at the top in most categories. It was faster than the Zero, tougher than the Zero, better armed than the Zero, and easier to fly than the Zero. The only advantage the Zero retained was its low-speed maneuverability, which became irrelevant when Hellcat pilots refused to engage in slow-speed turning fights. The design became official in ways O'Hare never saw. On November 26, 1943, Lieutenant Commander Edward O'Hare took off on a night combat air patrol mission aboard a Hellcat from the Enterprise. He was testing new night fighter tactics, using radar-equipped Avenger torpedo bombers to guide fighters to Japanese bombers attacking the fleet. The tactics worked and the formation intercepted the Japanese aircraft in darkness. But during the engagement, O'Hare's Hellcat disappeared. Radio messages went unanswered, and search aircraft found nothing. O'Hare was declared missing in action, presumed dead. He was 30 years old. The official investigation concluded that O'Hare was probably shot down by defensive fire from a Japanese bomber, or possibly by friendly fire from the Avenger's tail gunner. His body was never recovered and his aircraft was never found. He was posthumously promoted to commander. In 1949, Chicago's Orchard Field Airport was renamed O'Hare International Airport in his honor. A restored Wildcat painted in his markings is displayed in Terminal 2, showing Japanese flags to mark his aerial victories. The display was formally opened on the 75th anniversary of his Medal of Honor flight. William Schwendler continued designing aircraft for Grumman until the end of the war. He led the development of the F7F Tigercat twin-engine fighter and contributed to the design of the F8F Bearcat. After the war, Schwendler worked on jet aircraft before retiring in 1960. He never received public recognition for the Hellcat design, though his name appeared in Grumman's internal documents as the chief design engineer. He passed away in the early 1980s. His obituary mentioned his work on naval aircraft, but it didn't specifically mention the Hellcat or the meeting with O'Hare that shaped its design. David McCampbell survived the war and stayed in the Navy, eventually reaching the rank of captain. He commanded the carrier Bonhomme Richard during the late 1950s and served in various staff positions before retiring in 1964. He remained active in naval aviation circles, attending reunions and speaking at events. He told the story of the Hellcat many times, always emphasizing that it was the best carrier fighter of World War II. McCampbell died in 1996 at age 86 and is buried at Arlington National Cemetery. A destroyer, the USS McCampbell, was commissioned in his honor in 2002. The Hellcat remained in service with the Navy until 1954, when the last F6F 5N night fighters were retired from operational squadrons. Some Hellcats were converted into remote-controlled drones and used in the Korean War to attack North Korean targets. Others were sold to foreign air forces. The French Navy flew Hellcats from the carrier Aromanches until 1961, and Uruguay used them until 1961, making it one of the longest operational careers for a World War II fighter. In 1987, the National Naval Aviation Museum in Pensacola, Florida, restored an F6F Hellcat in the markings of McCampbell's aircraft, Mincy 3, with 34 Japanese flags painted on the fuselage. The aircraft is on permanent display. 7 Hellcats remain airworthy today, all based in the United States, regularly flying at air shows and commemorative events. The historical record eventually documented the connection between O'Hare's visit to Grumman and the Hellcat's design. In 1991, a naval historian researching World War II carrier operations found references to O'Hare's April 1942 meeting in Bureau of Aeronautics files. The historian interviewed Schwendler's assistant, who confirmed that O'Hare's combat feedback directly influenced several critical design decisions, including the engine selection, cockpit visibility improvements, and hydraulic landing gear. The historian estimated that these design changes, implemented based on one 4-hour meeting, contributed significantly to the Hellcat's combat success and likely saved between 1,000 and 1,500 American pilots' lives during the war, based on the aircraft's kill ratio and loss rate compared to the Wildcat. But O'Hare never knew. He died 18 months before the Hellcat proved itself at the Marianas Turkey Shoot. He never saw the aircraft achieve a 19.1 kill ratio. He never saw McCampbell shoot down 34 Japanese aircraft or the Hellcat sweep Japanese aviation from the skies. He died flying the aircraft he helped design, defending the fleet, doing the job he'd trained for. That's how innovation happens in war, through combat veterans who survive long enough to explain what works, engineers who listen and implement changes quickly, and commanders who trust both groups enough to make radical design changes because lives depend on getting it right.